We now come to the last and perhaps the most interesting presentation. This is going to be on the politics of the budget. Pratap.
Interesting non-presentation. So how does one feel about this budget? And there's that old joke, somebody goes to a doctor and comes out and he's asked, what did you think about the doctor? He said, very good doctor. He said, why? He said, did not administer any injections. The question is asked, but will the doctor cure you? He said, that I don't know. And I actually am getting a little worried listening to my colleagues whether this budget has that quality. I agree with them. I think the temptation not to spend money, good thing. There's a lot of interesting institutional stuff in the budget, which if it is followed through, new dispute resolution mechanism for PPP, some good tax reforms, some good SME stuff, it's a whole bunch of stuff, Aadhaar potentially, if that kind of finally, that, in the long run could begin to address some, I think what Manish has called sort of chronic problems rather than acute problems. What I don't know, and I think this pertains to the politics of this and the psychology of the budget, is what's the problem the budget is trying to fix, and is it adequate to fixing that problem? I think that's the test. We've done the mathematical test of the budget, as it were, right? So let me first lay that out, and I know this is a controversial thing to say in the company of economists, but most of us ordinary citizens, and I think the globe, is very confused about what exactly is wrong with us. When you say 7 to 7.75%, there's actually nothing terribly wrong with us, right? Now, of course, we know it's under the new series, and of course we know, that's perfectly fine, but it doesn't feel like a 7.5% economy to anybody. And the government has caught itself in a bind, because if you had said our growth is 4.8% or 5%, then you would come up with a different diagnosis. Then the case for public investment, then the case for stimulating demand is there. We are so much into this management because we want to say that we don't actually have a crisis. We are the best growing economy in the world, right? So 7.75. Now, once you put yourself into that trap, you actually can't ask very hard questions about how much of a deep hole are you actually in. So my first political problem with the budget, and I think it's a problem in the perception of this budget, is actually there is no honesty about that. The economic survey is actually very clear that we are in a really, really deep hole, right? But everything, every assumption you have made about what needs to be fixed cannot acknowledge that deep hole. Okay? So that's the first problem, and I think it is a political problem. It is a political problem because the only thing you can claim credit for is that we have 7 to 7.5 growth, right? That's the headline of the last 2 years of economic achievement, very little else, right? So I'm afraid the politics has contaminated the economic presentation of the argument, and I think as intellectuals we are collaborating with that, frankly. Okay? The second thing that worries me about this budget, and there, it's not a worry about the budget itself. In fact, I think the budget is actually, I'd say it's reflecting actually a deeply pessimistic psychology about India. Okay, and I think one should lay that pessimism on the table. Why is it pessimistic? Why have we restrained ourselves in public spending, right? And of course, there's the issue of states will do more of it. I actually think the one thing politicians are right about, and I think this is nobody saying this, but this is the underlying assumption, is public spending, even consumption spending, will have to explode over the next 2 years. The rural distress, unless we are lucky with a great monsoon this year, is going to deepen. The follow-through of the 7th Pay Commission for states is always immensely disruptive. Ratin knows this, that there's been more devolution to the states in terms of the Finance Commission allocations. But the sorting out of the state's committed liabilities under all centrally sponsored schemes, most state governments actually don't know how much money they're going to have compared to their liabilities over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think implicitly, and this is a good reason to be prudent right now, but implicitly the government is actually acknowledging we actually don't know how this revenue stuff is going to pan out over the next 2 or 3 years. I won't celebrate too prematurely this cutting down on revenue. I think the politicians, I think understand that this dynamic is actually not looking good over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? And we don't have, in a sense, a sort of a, so it's pessimistic in that sense. Okay? What seems like an achievement is born out of deep pessimism on the revenue. It's pessimistic in a second sense, which is, there's no underlying sense of the diagnosis. And if one were being fair to the government, we could say something like the following, which is, certainly the global uncertainty is playing a big part in the lack of revival of private investment. I mean, we are entering into uncharted waters, right? And again, the government was a prisoner of its own mythology. Slowdown of China is good for us. The slowdown of any major economy in the world is not good for anybody else in the world, okay? Now, and we are entering into uncharted global deflation, competitive devaluations of a different kind are back. If you were private capital, your biggest question, I just don't know what world I'm entering in, right? So that's one hypothesis for why private investment is not picking up. Second hypothesis for private investment is, of course, all the crony capitalist story, the stuck assets, whether we have mechanisms for renegotiating that. And it's different in different sectors. In real estate, it's an entirely a crony capitalist story, right? And the emphasis in this budget on trying to sort of rescue the real estate sector with even more concessions, rather than getting the DLFs and the Unitex of the world to come to heel and drive hard bargains, is quite worrying. Lot of money in an incredibly corrupt, malpriced sector, right? And this is the one sector that has got the biggest infusion in tax base in this budget. So I'm not too happy about that part of it. The other side, renegotiative assets in the power sector and stuff, the government has been slow on it. To its credit, it's recognized the problem, but let's be clear, this is at least a 2-year process. Partly because Indian capital, I think, is slow to wake up to the new realities of India, right? I think the Indian state will actually become more regulatorily consistent. I don't think Indian capital is ready to play by the new transparent rules. So it's like who blinks first, and looks like in the real estate, the government has blinked first. Okay? Third sense in which it's a deeply pessimistic budget, absolutely everybody talks about state capacity. Rajat rightly mentioned it. There is no getting around the fact that state capacity is going to cost a lot of money upfront. We have been deluding ourselves. Of course, there's a problem of inefficiency and some misallocation within the state, but you're living in a fool's paradise, right? If you think you can build state capacity without investing in the state, basic sovereign functions, law and justice, right? Where is the investment, right? Basic sovereign functions like police, where is the investment? Basic sovereign functions like, capacity building at the lower level, where is the investment? There is no strategy for the state. And you cannot think of a 21st century successful economy without a strategy for the state. All we have heard, this is the problem with our reform discourse, which is we keep saying state capacity is not going to, capacity is very expensive. Statisticians are very expensive. You have a broken down statistical system in the state, right? I'd love to see an incredible investment in India's statistical apparatus. You can't do health interventions because you don't have an epidemiological mapping of the country, right? Zero investment in state capacity, right? So in all of those things that actually matter, it is actually a deeply pessimistic budget. It's basically saying, let's be prudent because we are not sure. It's uncertain trajectory. We don't know what to do with the state, as it were, and we don't know what this underlying kind of diagnosis is. What also politically worries me about this budget no matter what your ideological views in the government, and the government evokes strong ideological feelings, there was one school of thought that this government has made a political pact with the extreme right, which is you do the culture stuff, you let us do the economy stuff, right? That was the sort of the contract within the party. That's how, right? I'm actually beginning to think that the lack of political boldness in the budget, and political boldness means this government has not taken a single political risk in its 2 years in power, actually suggests something deeper. What it suggests is it is actually going to invest all its political capital fighting those culture battles and not do the hard economic stuff, which is different from as sinister as that older social contract was. You take care of culture, we'll take care of economics. It's actually, no, we are going to spend all our political capital on politics. And I think the beginning in Parliament is a very clear indication of that, right? So don't expect great and deep investments in political capital, right? On the politics side of it, the investment in the social sector, very deeply worrying. It's very deeply worrying for a couple of reasons. Of course, again, it's an illusion to think these sectors are not going to cost money. I think Shanti is absolutely right about that. UGC allocations have been slashed. Very clear indication that this government is not going to, does not see a future for public universities. Okay, it's very clear. If you don't read the writing on the wall, you're living in a fool's paradise. Okay, you cannot imagine again a vibrant 21st century economy. And India, is in this position. It's both our challenge and opportunity that it has to do everything together. You have to be in the high value added research end of this thing, and you have to be in the private, in the primary end of the scale, right? Very clear indication this government doesn't even begin to understand what the issues are with education and has absolutely zero commitment to reforming it in any meaningful way. Okay? But the health and education story is also important for the other economic side of the story. I mean, as you know, almost everybody in the private consultancy business has been saying over and over again, we don't know how health and education is priced in this country, right? These are probably the sectors with the two highest degrees of inflation, probably absorb income increases the greatest, right? So if you're serious about stimulating other kinds of demand, you need to tackle health and education. I mean, Piketty gets a bad name in this country. I don't know quite why, but one of the very important points he makes, you'll have inflated GDPs when you have greater private health and education, right? So even if you want the demand side of the story to continue, right, you need to invest in health and education. And there's no conception, there's no framework. What is the framework for health? We are doing a pastiche. 20,000 crore ka insurance yahan kar do, what is the 10-year plan about what is the architecture of health delivery you want, right? NHS style, totally private insurance, totally out of pocket. Unless you work backwards from that, there is no framework for even understanding what these allocations actually add up to, right? So it's a budget that has given up, and to be fair, all governments are responsible for this. And we haven't had a good education minister since God knows when, right? We haven't had a major health reform, serious health minister since God knows when, right? But at this point in the 21st century, again, reflects incredible pessimism about these two sectors, right? So I think it's actually a deeply sort of pessimistic budget. This last point, and then I kind of end it there. How will the politics of this budget play out? I think the middle class is not going to be happy, which may not be a bad thing. It's sometimes good from an economic point of view not to keep the middle class happy. But that was a very big constituency for this government. Frankly, I think the miscommunication over this Provident Fund, the PPF thing, and the government's absolutely atrocious framing of the issue. Why can't they have done a simple thing saying, look, this is the 10-year pension architecture we want to move to. In that context, these steps make sense, right? Instead, what you got was all kinds of patronizing nonsense about how people don't know how to spend their own money, right? So middle class is going to lukewarm, right? Farmers, that is the big rhetorical pitch in this budget. If they deliver on everything else, PMGSY, agriculture, I mean, look, irrigation has been around for a long time, as you know, the irrigation trust is not new. Maybe 2 or 3 years' time, some turnaround, but the fact of the matter is, in the short run, when you have rural demand collapsing and a serious agrarian crisis, there is not going to be much infusion of cash in the rural economy, right? So again, what was the diagnosis? Are you actually trying to stimulate big rural demand or not? What is the extent of that, right? So I don't think people are going to sort of feel that, as it were, that there's a, you know, there's a, so, and as I said, they have frittered away, I think, almost all their political capital on, you know, completely sort of irrelevant, at least irrelevant to the economy, other than in negatively destructive issues. So my sense of this budget is that if one were to rate it highly, one would rate it highly for prudence, as everybody has been saying. But there are different kinds of prudence. There's one prudence which says this is prudence because we actually know what we are doing. And there's a kind of prudence which says we actually don't know what we are doing, so we might as well be prudent in this fiscal sense. I'm afraid it looks more like the second. Because as I said, we are happy we haven't been, you know, delivered pinpricks, no injections, no big operation. But, you know, will growth be revived? We don't know. Is lack of demand the basis of growth? We don't know. Will this budget address that? We don't know. Infrastructure, say, I just saw Vinayak Chatterjee kind of saying, forget infrastructure for 2 years, right? You're not going to get a major revival. If that's the situation we are in, then actually you need a different kind of diagnosis. So we've got a prescription, no injection. I don't know whether we're going to be cured. And given our politics, Haryana, Gujarat, right, states where the BJP is going losing big time ground, expect this to be a really socially conflictual year from hell. Thanks.